Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. John Lewis. So I'm going to ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please. Good morning, Mr. Lewis.
Good morning.
Are you ready to go?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. Members of the panel, good morning to you. Mr. Lewis, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I'd now like to ask you about an email of the 2nd of July 2014, which is where we've got to in the chronology, at NHB 50732, please. And if we scroll to the very bottom of the email chain, we can see that it's an email at the bottom of page 2 over to page 3. And if we start at the bottom of page 2, we can see an email from Brian Martin of the 2nd of July at 11:42, subject fire safety facades. And he says, "Hi Neil," and it's addressed to Neil Smith. "Hi Neil, I've been talking to a few folk about fire safety and facades recently." And if we go to page 3, please, picking it up at the top of that page. "Allegedly, several buildings have been erected where PIR insulation has been used in cladding panels well over 18 metres in height. Apparently, people are under the impression that PIR is a material of limited combustibility, which it isn't. Again, allegedly, many of these buildings are blocks of flats. I've no idea how true these allegations are, but they come from relatively reliable sources. The purpose of my email is a friendly warning. You might want to double-check with your inspectors and plan checkers that they are on top of this. Happy to discuss. Regards, Brian." Now, can we assume that you were aware in July 2014 that PIR insulation was combustible?
Yes, I was.
Yes. Had the NHBC been providing building control and warranty services to buildings over 18 metres using PIR insulation as opposed to phenolic, which we know Kingspan K15 was, before receiving this email from Brian Martin?
We knew the products more by their trade names. So we would have known, we would have heard the terms K15 or Celotex RS5000, which were the two insulations which were predominantly used, which we knew about. I'm not sure, and I'm still not sure, which of those other materials out there are PIR insulation. We were tending to think of the whole family of PIR, PUR and phenolics as kind of a family of combustible insulations. We weren't splitting our thoughts down individually between those three types.
No, very well. But on the basis of the family, that PIR, PUR and phenolic belong to the same family, can we take it that NHBC had been providing building control services and warranty services in respect of buildings over 18 metres which contained one or other member of that family, including PIR?
Yes, because we knew that K15 was being used.
Well, K15 is phenolic, but PIR particularly.
I'm not sure which of the insulations are PIR.
Right. Do you remember what the reaction was within NHBC to the friendly warning that we get here from government?
I don't think it came as a surprise. The use of combustible types of insulation was commonplace.
Now, you say in your statement, and I don't think we need to go to it, but I'll give you the reference. It's page 66, paragraph 242. By reference to this document, that you weren't copied into it. You say, however, Steve Evans forwarded this to me on 15th of August 2014 as Brian Martin had praised the drafting of the guidance note in a subsequent email. Now, we'll come to look at the rest of the email string in a moment. Was the first that you knew of this warning from Brian Martin on the 15th of August 2014 when Steve Evans forwarded it to you?
Yes, I believe it was.
Right. So can we take it from that you didn't have any discussion with Steve Evans about this email before he forwarded it to you on the 15th of August?
I don't recall any, no.
And you say in paragraph 243 of your statement that you recall only discussing this email with Steve Evans and nobody else. Was that discussion in July when the email came, or only in August after he sent it to you?
Could you move up to the second page? I'm just trying to get the timeline.
Yes, of course,
clear.
absolutely. Let's do that. I'll show you the whole email string.
Please, thank you.
That helps. Let's take it chronologically. So I've shown you the bottom of page 2. If we scroll up to the bottom of, or further up page 2, we can see the email of the 2nd of July at the bottom and half of Steve Evans' response. If we go on to page 1, at the bottom of page 1, we can see Steve Evans' reply of the 11th of July 2014 to Brian Martin, copy to Diane Marshall and Neil Smith. And then above that, Brian Martin's response, and that's the July correspondence. We'll look at the 15th of April email later. But my question is one of recollection. Do you remember discussing this email string with Steve Evans in July, or do you remember discussing it with him only after the middle of August?
No, I believe we discussed it not long after it had been received.
Right. So in July.
Yes.
Right. Do you remember discussing the matter yourself with Brian Martin at any time?
No, I never had any contact with Brian Martin. Not direct, from myself, no.
If we go back to your statement, I should show this to you. Page 66, please, paragraph 244. You say, in paragraph 244, I understood the friendly warning to be in reference to the PIR insulation being used on tall residential buildings that NHBC was involved with, and that Brian Martin was suggesting that we verify the basis on which we were accepting it. I do not know the identity of the, quotes, relatively reliable sources, quotes, referred to in Brian Martin's email. What buildings were NHBC involved with at the time that were using PIR insulation?
Again, I'm not sure which of the insulation types are PIR. We were treating PIR, PUR, phenolic as a product family, and our references generally were on that basis.
Yes. So does it come to this, in the light of that answer and the one you gave me earlier, that you knew that PIR insulation was being used on tall residential buildings with which NHBC was involved, but you couldn't identify specifically what the insulation product was without going into the detail?
It's difficult to say. I mean, if I knew which of the product were PIR, then I would have a much clearer recollection.
Well, let me try it this way. When you saw this email for the first time, can we take it that you didn't understand, you didn't think that it didn't apply? In other words, your reaction wasn't, well, this doesn't apply to us because NHBC has not signed off any buildings with PIR on them.
No, my thoughts at the time were, rather than reading PIR, read PIR, PUR, phenolic together and, consider it on that basis, that group of products.
Do you know what prompted the friendly warning coming so soon as it did after the launch of issue 0 of Technical Guidance Note 18 by the BCA?
No.
Were you aware of, or made aware of, which projects Mr. Martin was referring to?
No.
Do you know how Brian Martin was aware of what projects the NHBC was involved with featured PIR insulation?
I didn't. I had no idea.
Did you think that this warning extended also to phenolic insulation? One assumes on the family answer that it did, yes?
Yes, that was my thoughts.
Yes. Did anybody, to your knowledge, in NHBC go back and check the basis on which it was being accepted, as Brian Martin suggests you should do?
At that stage, we were already well on with, the Kingspan and issue and drafting of the BCA guidance note.
Well, forgive me, it had already come out, in fact. It came out in June. We looked at it yesterday. So I'm putting this to you on the basis that the friendly warning comes a matter of weeks only after the guidance note was published. So again, my question, did anybody in NHBC, to your knowledge, having received this friendly warning from government, do as Brian Martin had suggested and actually go and check the basis on which PIR was being accepted?
We just treated it along the lines of the way we'd been looking at the K15 issue and the way we'd come to the conclusions that the K15 and the basis on which that was accepted was what it was.
Right.
Sorry. Apologies if I've not answered the question. Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Did anybody in HBC, to your knowledge, having received this friendly warning from government, go and check the basis on which PIR or any other family member of combustible insulation was being accepted by NHBC on tall buildings?
Well, we'd already gone through that process with the K15, so no, there was not a separate inquiry after that stage, after that email, no.
So can we take it from that answer that NHBC, to your knowledge, and you in particular, when you've discovered it, were not particularly concerned by this warning?
No, we were concerned.
But you didn't act on it?
We were already acting on it with the discussions with Kingspan and Celotex and people like that.
Did this communication from Brian Martin set any alarm bells off in your mind about the number of buildings for which you, as in NHBC, had up to that point been accepting combustible insulation on, including K15?
At that stage, we already knew that K15 was, the go-to product on many of the schemes we were involved with. We knew there were a substantial number of schemes without insulation on it.
Do you remember whether anybody voiced the opinion that now that government had got itself involved, even informally through the friendly warning, it was time to stop accepting combustible insulation materials over 18 metres, since you had all at least been aware of the routes to compliance and the dangers of combustible materials from October or November the previous year?
I don't recall it changed what we were doing. We'd already at that point, as you say, issued the BCA guidance note. Sorry, I lost track. What was the question?
Well, now that government had got involved, to your knowledge, did anybody voice the view that it was now time to stop accepting combustible insulation products on tall buildings?
I don't remember anything directly of that nature saying we should stop, no.
Now, can we go back to the email run, please, that we looked at a moment ago? I just want to show you Steve Evans' reply to Brian Martin of the 11th of July. It's there at the foot of page 1 and goes over to page 2. I'm not going to read it all out to you, but if you just look at the first paragraph with me. I hope that you are well. Neil Smith has discussed your email with me below and asked me to respond as I've been dealing with this on behalf of NHBC. This is an issue that NHBC are aware of and have been in discussions with industry about it for some time. And he goes on to say, the issue is in respect of the use of Kingspan Cooltherm K15 rain screen board in buildings over 18 metres in height. The confusion has arisen, etc. Now, I hope I've read enough of that to you for you to be familiar with it, if you were. My question is, do you remember whether Steve Evans discussed this reply with you before it was sent to Brian Martin on the 11th of July, 2014?
I don't recall that he did, and Steve would very often ask me to draft up a response for him to top and tail, and I don't think I did that with this one, so
right.
That would imply that we probably didn't discuss it. Steve just did it.
Do you know why Steve Evans would choose not to discuss this response to government with you, given that you were at this time NHBC's sole qualified fire engineer?
I think Steve, with it being Brian Martin, would have kept it to just the senior people at NHBC. Neil Smith was in a senior head of department role, as was Diane. I assume that, it being government, they just kept it within themselves.
Well, keeping it within themselves so far as the circulation of the email response is one thing, but do you know why Steve Evans chose to keep the substance of the response from you and not call on your assistance in order to produce it?
I don't, but, the response that I'm reading here was only what he and I both knew, would have agreed on. I think a lot of it is probably based on what we wrote in the BCA guidance note, so I never read anything into it at all. Right.
Well, let me just ask you about one aspect of it, please. If we go to page 2, second paragraph down on that page, it's the pre-penultimate paragraph in the email, and it reads as follows. As we had a number of projects, can you see in the second paragraph?
I can, thank you, yes.
Yes. As we had a number of projects under construction and in advanced stages of design utilising K15, NHBC approached Kingspan and made them aware of our concerns. As a result of this dialogue, Kingspan are currently undertaking further testing using different cladding and facade treatments in accordance with BS 8414 Part 2 of 2002. The results from the tests are expected by the end of this month, and NHBC are meeting with Kingspan at the beginning of August, at which time Kingspan will be asked to provide evidence that their product can be used in alternative construction types other than that specified in the current BBA certificate. And then he goes on as follows. There is no reason to suspect that buildings which have been built with Kingspan K15 are at risk at this time. It is just the fact that the testing carried out to date does not bear this out. Kingspan are confident that the current testing currently underway will prove the suitability of the material for use over 18 metres. If they're not able to do this, we will begin the process of informing industry that the product is no longer suitable for use in facades over 18 metres, as well as informing other stakeholders such as BCA and the Fire and Rescue Service, although both parties are already aware of our ongoing discussions. Now, do you agree that further testing on specific systems under BS 8414 Part 1 could not make K15 suitable for use in all facades over 18 metres generically, could it?
I believe that's a typo. I think Steve meant 8414 Part 2 because the discussions we were having with Kingspan at the time, it was only the Part 2 test that they were doing.
Well, it doesn't matter, with great respect. My question wasn't focused on Part 1 necessarily. Do you agree that further testing on specific systems, whether under 8414 Part 1 or Part 2, could not make K15 suitable for use in all facades generically?
No, not generically.
No. And Mr. Evans, as we can see, doesn't say that Kingspan were going to subject every single build-up into which they had supplied K15 historically, or were proposing to do so. Does he? He doesn't say that. And we can read that.
No.
So, and do you agree that if they had done that, that would be thousands of tests occupying the BRE burn hall for months?
Yes, it would be several thousand potential combinations, yes.
Yes. Now, on that question, did Mr. Evans consult you? Did he ask you, did he come to you at any stage and say, is it reasonable to say to the government that the tests proposed by Kingspan K15 will justify the use of K15 on any tall building facade?
No.
No. Now, let's go to NHB 757, which is an email chain in the summer of 2014. And if we go to page 3 in that email, we can see that it's dated the 16th of June. 2014, from Steve Evans to Richard Bromwich, who was the National Business Development Manager at Kingspan, and a number of others, including you. You see that?
Yes.
Now, this is the month before the friendly warning from Brian Martin, 2nd of July 2014. And we can see that Steve Evans asks Richard Bromwich for an update on the use of K15 over 18 metres. You see that? And in the second paragraph of that email, he says this: the latest version of the BBA certificate extracted below makes it clear that only a construction similar to that tested can be considered as meeting the requirements of BS 8414 Part 1, K15 backed directly onto a masonry wall. It's noted that the additional wording of the earlier BBA certificate, whereby advice on alternative constructions could be sought from Kingspan, has now been removed. NHBC has not been provided with anything further that is based on BS 8414 to prove performance from accredited independent testing in accordance with BR 135 recommendations. As such, as a building control body, NHBC Building Control Services is in a difficult situation. Whilst we do not wish to prejudice the construction of a large number of tall buildings in which K15 is being used as an insulant, we do not have any suitable basis under Regulation 7 for the acceptance of the external envelope design where it moves away from the construction used to compile the BBA certificate. And then in red and bold, therefore I must advise you that, unless additional test evidence supporting the use of K15 in constructions which differ from the BS 8414 Part 1 test can be provided before 30th of June 2014, NHBC Building Control Services will need to reconsider its acceptance of K15 in buildings over 18 metres as fit for purpose. Was the reluctance that we see here on the basis that NHBC would find themselves in difficulty because of the large number of buildings that had been historically approved using K15?
Now, at that point, we were 6 months into a situation where buildings were registered after the 31st of December 2013, so we're in the current BBA certificate, which didn't give the option to go back to Kingspan. So the difficult situation was with regards to that set of, admittedly probably not very many buildings at that stage, which had been registered with us since, the start of that year. They were the ones that the focus of this email was particularly on at this time.
How many buildings was Steve Evans referring to when he says a large number of tall buildings, as you can see in the third paragraph there?
I can't quantify that. I don't know what the figure would have been.
If the NHBC as a building control body felt that they could not accept the external envelope design because there was no 8414 test applying to it, there was no way around that, was there?
No, but like I said, these were in build. The day of reckoning, as it were, was when those buildings came for requiring a final certificate. And there was still, usually in many cases, several months to run before we were into that situation where we were being asked to give that certificate. So we were running with this period of time during which we were hoping, and Kingspan were assuring us that they would get together, sufficient test data to enable more informed decisions to be taken.
Certainly. And why not, therefore, or why did the NHB, therefore, not spell out the fact that unless, within that period, the precise proposed external wall build-up was subjected to a BS 8414 Part 1 or Part 2 test and satisfied the BR 135 criteria, it would not be accepted by NHBC's building control?
I don't know why that was taken. That decision was taken. As you put in my witness statement, that red paragraph, my suggested wording was very different.
Yes, why is that?
Because at the time, we were now 6 months into this dialogue with Kingspan, and it was becoming clear to me that Kingspan had made assurances that they would have a big body of test evidence and everything would be fine, and that was just not panning out, and we were 6 months into the process, and we weren't really any further on by that point. They'd done the TRESPA test, which had clearly failed, And I think that was about as far as we'd got by that point.
Exactly. So why not just draw a line under it and say, no 8414, no certificate?
It was not a decision for me to take.
No, you've made that point a number of times, Mr. Lewis, and I'm not suggesting it was. My question is an NHBC question. Can you explain, sitting there today, why NHBC did not make that decision?
No, I think NHBC was aware that to do that, would have it would have created a storm within the industry on these buildings, and NHBC needed to be mindful, if it was going to make that storm, then it wanted to be clear that it was necessary and would have been done. I think one point which we at the NHBC did have in mind at the time was that legally, if NHBC was not prepared to accept the building with K15 on it, then that meant we would not be able to issue a final certificate, and the regulatory process meant that then those schemes would have to revert back to local authority building control for them to take enforcement action. We had in the back of our minds that LABC had a certificate accepting it as a material of limited combustibility and were generally accepting buildings with this material on it. And so we were kind of thinking, well, is there a great deal in point in rejecting them and sending them back to the local authority if they're likely to only still get approved under the local authority's ways of doing things?
Why not talk to the LABC about it at this point?
Those discussions had been had via the BCA.
Exactly. Why not go through the BCA and have those urgent discussions?
I don't know. Again, Steve would have done that.
We'll come back to the LABC in a moment, but before I do, can I just ask you to be scrolled up to page 2, at the foot of page 2 of this email run, where we see an email of the 14th of July 2014 from Steve Evans to Ivor Meredith at Kingspan, copied to Dave White, among others, and you, as well as Graham Perrier and Richard Bromwich of Kingspan. Dear Ivor, and over to page 3, please find attached copies of recent communications that NHBC have had with DCLG in respect of the fire safety and facades. I've also been keeping colleagues at Building Control Alliance, LABC, and the Fire Brigade up to date with progress of our discussions. Now, it looks as if Steve Evans was forwarding the friendly warning correspondence, the Brian Martin email of the 2nd of July and his response of the 11th of July, to a number of people within Kingspan, and indeed to you. Now, before he sent it, did he discuss with you his intention to send the correspondence with the DCLG to Kingspan?
Very likely, but I can't recall it specifically.
Do you remember what he or the NHBC more generally hoped to achieve by doing so?
I would guess the more pressure we put onto Kingspan, the more likely they were to come up with some goods. Right.
Can we take it from this that, in fact, you did see the friendly warning email and the 11th of July response before your discussion before the email in August?
Yes, I believe that was the case, yes.
Do you think this was the first time you saw the friendly warning email and the NHBC response to it?
I don't think so. I mean, Steve and I worked closely. I don't believe Steve was keeping anything from me for any particular reason. We were completely open.
Now, looking back at the emails here and paraphrasing the rest of the chain, we can see that a meeting is arranged for the 6th of August between NHBC and Kingspan. And if we go to the top of the chain at page 1, here is an email from Steve Evans to Ivor Meredith of the 15th of August, copied, among others, to you. Ivor, my apologies for delaying in responding. Final copy of BCA guidance note attached, which will be on the BCA website shortly. Unfortunately, they're in the process of switching administrators, so there's been a delay in updating the site. In the meantime, is it possible to get a letter of comfort from BRE confirming the results and the likely results, and then a follow-up letter from Arup explaining what they will be doing with the results. I feel this is necessary to protect all our positions, given that it could be a further 3 months before we get this resolved, and the number of buildings currently using or planning to use K15. Now, you, I think, were at the meeting of the 6th of August 2014, weren't you?
I was, yes.
Do you remember what Kingspan had promised from BRE and Arup at that meeting?
I recall by that point, Kingspan had they'd done the Trespa test, they'd done the terracotta test. I believe the terracotta test had only just recently been done and they hadn't had the report from BRE, hence the letter of comfort asking, you know, that BRE just say, yes, it's done and it's passed. And Arup, Kingspan had spoken to Arup, or they told us that they had spoken to Arup to get Arup to, you know, do something with the range of results they were getting to give further comfort to the likes of the building control bodies that enabled their product to be, you know, better accepted, or a better, you know, well, yes, better accepted.
Right. Did either of the letters of comfort from BRE or from Arup ever materialise?
Certainly the one from Arup never did. I don't recall anything from BRE.
To your understanding, when Steve Evans said that he felt the need to protect all our positions, did that include NHBC's position?
We were getting uncomfortable by that point, yes.
Right. And was it Brian Martin's friendly warning that had prompted NHBC's feeling for the need to protect its position?
No, we were uncomfortable right from
Right.
the start of this year,
I see.
being 2014.
And did you or anybody else at NHBC suggest that the use of K15 be paused while you resolved that issue? Or did NHBC just plough on and continue to accept K15?
As I say, the thinking at the time was, let's give Kingspan the chance to come up with this big body of data and see if that resolves or makes life easier or clearer.
Right. But by this time, as I think we've established, you had seen Steve Evans' response of the 11th of July, and I read to you part of that, which, and I paraphrase, said that just because there's no test results doesn't mean it's not safe. Were you concerned by that?
If Steve got that, I believe, from, and as I said yesterday, the assurances from Kingspan that their product wasn't a massive fire risk. You know, I refer to the blow lamp video, the test that they had got. We weren't aware of the failed tests. The thinking was, at least at the start, that it wasn't a massive fire risk.
How would you know that without a test?
Well, we only had the 8414, the Part 1, the 2005 test. That was the only test in existence, and that did show a good level of, you know, of passing when put under the BR135 parameters.
I mean, given your, as you've just told us, your discomfort, NHBC's discomfort, not only from the time of the friendly warning, but actually from the beginning of the year, why not tell Brian Martin that exact fact?
I don't know.
Now, I want to ask you now about LABC. We touched on it a moment ago, Mr. Lewis. Let's look at NHB 50616, please. Now, this is an email I think you were referring to yesterday, of the 2nd of December 2013, and it's from Steve Evans to Technical Services within NHBC. And the subject, as you can see, is use of Kingspan Cooltherm K15 rain screen board. Dear all, there has recently been some confusion in respect of the use of Kingspan Cooltherm K15 rain screen board in buildings over 18 metres in height. The confusion has arisen from Kingspan's statement that their product is acceptable for use in a building over 18 metres. However, the product is made from a generic type of polyurethane foams which are by nature combustible. Now, just pausing there, I think you would accept that's a mistake, isn't it? K15 is phenolic, not a polyurethane.
It is, but as I say, PUR, PIR, phenolic, we lumped as one family of materials.
Right. Now, if we go to your statement, please, at page 17, we can see that you say in paragraph 68A, having introduced this email in the opening words of paragraph 68, you answer the Inquiries Rule 9 questions about that email in the following way. A, I believe the confusion described in line 1 referred to Kingspan's assertion that their product is suitable for use on a building greater than 18 metres based on a local authority building control, LABC, system approval, which incorrectly implied that K15 could be considered a MULC, material of limited combustibility, when we were saying otherwise. You can see this from our discussion of the draft email on the same day, timed at 11:09, and you exhibit it. When did you first become aware of that LABC system approval?
I believe it was around 2012.
Now, it was released in 2008. Do you know why you weren't aware of it earlier than that?
No, I didn't have a lot to do with high-rise buildings particularly, and I just hadn't, I don't believe it had sort of come across my desk. I didn't go looking for it, obviously, but, you know, I wasn't aware it had been referred to me to look at.
If we go on in your statement to page 39, please, and let's look at the foot of that page at paragraph 154. This is under the heading LABC. And you say at 154, I recall reading the K15 LABC certification. The K15 certificate came to my attention as it said it could be considered a MULC, but I knew this was clearly not the case. And then over the page, at para 155, you say, I had concerns regarding the K15 LABC certificate as I knew it was wrong, but I was not able to intervene, and there was no one really to report it to, though NHBC did take the steps referred to in paragraphs 156 and 158 below. Needless to say, NHBC would not have accepted the certificate if it was presented to us as any form of evidence. Now, we've looked in this inquiry in depth at the LABC system approval for K15 and its incorrect assertions in relation to K15, as I think accepted. Do you know, or do you remember when you first read this certificate? I think you say 2012. Is that when you noticed the error?
Yes, I believe so. I think when I first had it shown to me, I don't think it took me very long to realise that that was incorrect.
Right, even though you hadn't in fact obtained your qualifications as a fire engineer.
Yeah, you didn't need to be a fire engineer to read Table A7 in ADB.
Right. Now, were you surprised in 2012 when you saw the erroneous certificate and spotted the error in it, that LABC, who was responsible for a large portion of the country's building control services, would release such a fundamentally erroneous statement about the fire safety of a product?
Yes, I was. But we weren't party to the full range of what LABC had looked at in arriving at that conclusion, but it certainly didn't fit with the K15 data sheet, which said it was Class C.
No. And why did you feel you were unable to intervene, as you say in your statement?
Because LABC were a different organisation to us, and because, you know, as I say there is no overarching body that looks at the LABC, as far as I'm aware. You know, there wasn't anyone to escalate up the chain if you had one of these concerns. The most you could do on any particular job was go to the head of building control for that particular borough and raise it to them. And on subsequent schemes, that was, you know, queries that we did forward. But beyond that, there was nowhere to go to, other than perhaps Brian Martin, but, you know.
Well, why not just write to LABC, the powers that be within LABC? It is, after all, an entity, even though, in fact, it contains or has membership across local authorities, and draw the error to their attention and ask them to correct it, or at least ask them why they've let it languish uncorrected for so long.
Well, that is kind of what Steve did, in around 2014.
I mean, given the close relationship between NHBC and LABC, as we've seen, was there nobody that you personally could pick up the phone to and alert them?
No, there wasn't.
And this error in the LABC certificate, was that in your mind in 2014 at the time of the friendly warning email?
Yes, it was.
So if in fact it was the case, as you told us, that you knew that the LABC certificate erroneously and misleadingly identified K15 as a material of limited combustibility when it obviously wasn't, how would the fact that LABC would or might take over the approval by way of enforcement if NHBC rejected it have helped? Because you knew that they would be accepting it on an erroneous basis.
Sorry, what?
Well, let me try it differently. What would have been the point of not making a fuss about K15 over 18 metres? Merely because the LABC was there as a backup and would have approved it anyway?
There wasn't really one.
No. Now, if we then go to your statement, please, at 153, going back a page, you say, in terms of the LABC certification process, I understood the purpose of gaining LABC type approval, system approval, or registered detail certificate for a product meant that the builder could present the certificate before any local authority and it would be accepted. I knew of these certificates, but I was not really familiar with them as NHBC did not accept LABC type approval. Why is it that NHBC did not accept LABC type approval?
Our understanding of the process by which LABC issued their approvals wasn't one that I think NHBC had a lot of confidence in, and on that basis would not rely upon them.
Did NHBC provide warranties on buildings where the local authority BCO had signed off in reliance on an LABC certificate? Do you know?
I would imagine that to be the case. I can't name any names, though.
No, but without, I mean, I'm sure you can't name any names. Maybe you can, but I'm not asking you to do so. What I am interested in is why it is the case that NHBC would provide warranties on buildings where the local authority BCO had signed a building off in reliance on an LABC certificate if NHBC had not a great deal of confidence in the process.
Well, I think prior to, this time around 2014, where we did decide to take, a stronger line on the warranty-only jobs, there would be a number of jobs that the LABC had signed off for building control, and we offered the warranty on. Yes.
Yes. Well, why? That's the question. There may be a lot, but why is that?
That was. Well, that was, we were a warranty body. On the schemes we were not doing the building control, we were simply offering a warranty. Yeah,
I mean, are you able to give us any insight into why it was or how it was that NHBC was prepared to offer a warranty on a building where the local authority building control officer had signed off the building as compliant in reliance on a LABC certificate?
Well, there were very different things. The warranty was to deal with defects. It was not there to deal with regulatory compliance.
Now let's look at NHB 810. This is an email between you and somebody called Jane Keeley of Ascent Building Control, dated the 13th of November 2014. Now, to paraphrase the first part of the email chain, what's happening here is that Jane Keeley is forwarding an email from another colleague who is querying K15 and asking you if the LABC certificate dated the 30th of November is still valid. And we can see your response at the top in the email of the 13th of November 2014. And you say this: "It's all garbage. Hereford LABC didn't know what they were talking about. We had a telephone call with LABC warranty technical manager, can't recall his name, at which he stated that they were withdrawing their approval straight away. That was on 27th of October, so I would check it's still valid if I was you. So it looks from this, is this right, that you finally did intervene in some way?
I guess so. I mean, Jane is a long-standing friend of mine.
Right.
She asked me because she knew that I was involved at NHBC looking at these particular issues.
I see. And do you say it's all garbage there for the reasons you've given, namely that the LAB certificate was plainly wrong when it referred to K15 as a material of limited combustibility?
I believe that's what I was referring to. It would be whatever Jane's question was to me.
Yeah, well, let's look down. To be fair to you, I haven't shown you the full email string, but if you go down to your own message, over to page 2, if we scroll through page 2 and look into page 3, you're actually setting out the reasons. And just pausing there, at the very end of the second paragraph there, we can see that you say it's not clear why the LABC detail states that it's a mock when it clearly isn't. So that's your message. And then you at the top of page 3, we can see that you set out the beige, I suppose that's the right colour, block where it says ADB fire safety note. From the results, it can be considered as a material of limited combustibility. And then 2 lines underneath that, since K15 can be considered a material of limited combustibility, it is suitable for use in all situations shown on diagram 40 of approved document B. I mean, you've highlighted those 2 in yellow, I think. So that's the point you were dealing with, isn't it? And is it that's why you say it's all garbage?
Could you just go to page 4 and I see what Jane actually did ask specifically?
Yes, of course. I think we need, in fact, to go on to page 5 to see what the question is. Good, it comes up to you.
No, sorry, could you go back to page 4?
Page 4 it is.
Yeah, so Jane was asking if the certificate, which was the LABC certificate, is still valid. And Jane asked me, is this the one that they are withdrawn or are withdrawing? So my response back was directly in relation to that certificate. And my first paragraph, I believe, the last sentence of that was saying, check it is still valid, because I understood they were withdrawing it.
Yeah. Now, going back to the top of the email to Jane itself, and the very first paragraph I've read to you, you tell Jane Keeley that you'd had a telephone call with the LABC warranty technical manager. And then you say, at which he stated they were withdrawing their approval straight away. How well do you remember that conversation?
It was, Steve arranged a telephone conference call, and he asked me to listen in. Well, I'd listen in and contribute, but I don't think I had anything to really contribute. And it was between Steve and myself. And this is where I really cannot remember who it was from LABC. I would imagine it was either Barry Turner or Doug Basson, but I'm kind of guessing on that.
Well,
I don't know if Steve, in his evidence, had a clearer view of, a recollection of that conversation.
My question is, do you remember whether you were told during the conversation, without being prompted, the LABC had already decided to withdraw their approval, or did they say to you that they were going to withdraw their approval straight away in light of what you'd said to them?
No, I believe that we had the conversation and pointed out that their certificate was erroneous, it was wrong, and I recall the words along the lines of, we'd better do something about that and take a look and withdraw it. It was something like that. Right.
And did the person, in saying that, express surprise? Did they try to defend it? Do you remember?
Not really. I kind of remember. They were a bit, not kind of. I'm struggling for the word. They didn't particularly see that it needed to be dealt with any immediate urgency.
Right. Now, if we...
Sorry, could I just say, I'm not sure this, whether they did withdraw that certificate soon after that conversation or not. I don't know if that's been established.
Now, going back to your email, if we can go back to page 1, you set out the contents of the BBA certificate and the details of the test there, and that's the 2005 test with the cementitious particle board that Kingspan had undertaken on K15, and you then go on to say on the next page, page 2, in the second paragraph, and I've shown you the end of this, but it starts as follows. Kingspan have since done at least 2 tests. I suspect they've done more, but have kept the results close to their chests because they performed so badly, ! Using a steel frame and ventilated rain screen, and there is an issue with ongoing burning. Once the fire source is extinguished, the insulation continues to burn up the cavity, and in one case continued over the cavity barrier and up to the top of the test rig. So it's not clear why the LABC detail states that it's a mulch when it clearly isn't. Now, how did you know about the issue of ongoing burning, as you put it?
That was taken from the TRESPA test.
Right. That's the TRESPA test, and you'd presumably seen the results of that, had you?
Yes, we had been presented with a copy of that report.
Right. Now, given that you were suspicious that Kingspan had been failing tests, as you say in the words in brackets there, yes?
Yes.
And given that you were aware of problems with ongoing burning, why was NHBC still continuing, even at this stage, to approve the use of K15 above 18 metres? We're now in November 2014.
Because we, at that point, came to realise that the performance of the 8414 tests wasn't just the insulation, it was a combination of insulation, cavity and external panel. And those three, well, largely those 3 components together were what drove whether you would pass a test or not. We knew that the K15 with the right cladding finish could pass these tests. With the wrong cladding finish, particularly ones which were highly combustible, it tended to be, actually, it was the cladding finish which was causing the flaming up the rig rather than the insulation. So we knew that the evidence at that point was pointing that it would work with certain types of external finish.
Well, just breaking that answer up into 2 further questions. First of all, am I right in thinking that you had always known, certainly since August 2013, that an 8414 test was a system test? It was always a question of performance of the entire system and not simply the performance of the insulation. Yes?
Yes, we knew that.
Yes. And secondly, when you say that the test evidence was pointing to the fact that it would work with certain types of external finish, it's right, isn't it, to say that the only test under 8414 in which K15 had passed, as it were, in other words, the whole rig had satisfied BR135, was the one using cementitious particle board as the rain screen, the details of which are set out in the BBA certificate you set out on page 1 of this email string.
That was the situation with K15. We were aware of, a 8414 Part 1 test using Extratherm, which was a similar family, within that family of materials, which had passed. We were, I think, aware of the Celotex test at that time with the Eternit material, which had passed. So that was, the basis on which we were looking at this. We knew that the performance of the family of materials, and in the cases that you could, take some assumptions.
Well, but so you were treating them as a family, but not, is this right, making any allowance for the difference between the chemical composition or the mechanical structure of each of these different products? No,
we were treating them as a group, family of, insulation products.
But Jane Keeley's asking you about K15, yes? Not extra therm or RS5000, yes?
Yes.
Yes, question again, focusing on K15, given that you had been suspicious about failed tests and ongoing burning, how could it have been any comfort to you that other products within the same family had passed 8414 tests within rigs using different range screen?
Well, I agree. The only test evidence we had for K15 at this point was the 2005 test.
Now,
No, because by this point there was also the K15 test with the Trespa, and I believe the K15 test with the terracotta finish at this point had already been issued.
not sure you'd had the details of the results of that yet, had you?
I believe we knew about it. This was in November 2014, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that test was carried out in July, or June or July, so I thought we had seen that one by this point.
The Trespa, though, which you have referred to, was the one which had actually produced the problem with ongoing burning.
Yeah, but the terracotta test was, the first terracotta test was carried out, wasn't that around July time?
I think June.
June, yeah. I would have thought we'd
Do you
seen
remember?
the report.
Well, be clear. Do you remember seeing the results of the terracotta test before sending this email?
I can't be sure, but I believe it was, yes, because the time period between the test being carried out and this email was 5 months. 4 months, 5 months. Surely, we would have seen the report by this point.
It's not something you refer to as a positive, is it, in your second paragraph that's still on the screen?
Sorry, what specifically?
The results of the terracotta test.
But the second paragraph, I'm referring to the statement in the BBA certificate.
Now let's go to page 3 of this email chain, where you, as we can see, set out in the beige box the element of the certificate that you set out, and you comment on it. And you say underneath it, as we can see in the brackets, the bit about using a non-combustible lining board instead of a masonry backing on a steel frame wall has since proved not to be correct. These words were Kingspans. They assumed that it would perform the same, but when they did the tests, it was found they performed far worse. Now, was that something you'd actually seen on sites or on proposed build-ups, the use of a non-combustible lining board in lieu of testing on a steel frame?
I hadn't seen it on site, but the reference to it was, I recall, the meetings with Kingspan, where they had said that in their view, and I can't recall the reasons, they said that, okay, it's not on a blockwork backing wall, but it's on a non-combustible board. Instead, it will perform in the same way, or at least as well as a blockwork wall. And that was it. It wasn't something I'd actually seen on site, but I had seen how these things were put together on site, typically with a lightweight steel frame and the boards and that lot.
Yes. Now, you then go on underneath that to say, it's all an accident waiting to happen, and we're meeting with all the PIR manufacturers to try and get something sorted. But in the meantime, they continue to state that it's fine, and most BCBs accept that at face value without sifting through the details. However, DCLG are now on the case, hence why we need to sort something out soon. On that, you continue to say, our current policy is to request a copy of a test on the proposed cladding build-up. If there isn't one, then we take the view that we can't apply the BBA approval or the BR 135 compliance. As such, it's recommended that a MOLC be used instead. I can elaborate further if you want. This is just the summary. Now, was it the contact from DCLG that made you finally intervene?
Intervene in what precisely?
Well,
by this point, we were already in the discussions with Kingspan and going through, that process of trying to get Kingspan to prove their product a bit more.
I see. Now, at what point had you decided that this was all an accident waiting to happen?
Those words I got, I believe we just had the meeting with Arup Fire, and Dr. Lane used those same words. I copied those words and used them in this email to Jane.
I was going to ask you that, and we'll see that. That's in her email of the 30th of October, 2014. So you had essentially agreed with her and used precisely the same expression?
Yes.
Yes, I see. And what was it that prompted you to agree with Dr. Lane to such an extent that you would essentially copy and paste her expression into an email to a colleague?
Well, I think Dr. Lane's, when she used the phrase, it wasn't specifically to do with the insulation. Dr. Lane used the phrase when referring to combustible 100% cord, polyethylene cord ACMs. So that's what she was referring to. I was referring to the fact that this situation with Kingspan K15 was not looking good. Hence why in my final sentence, I thought the best thing to recommend to Jane would be that they just don't go down the road with a K15 and use a non-combustible insulation instead. And that was because by this point in time, many of the clients at NHBC were opting to steer away from using K15 and to go, down a non-combustible route with their insulation instead.
Did your colleagues at NHBC share the views that you have described to Jane Keeley, namely that it's all an accident waiting to happen?
I believe everyone at NHBC knew that this was not a good situation.
So that's a yes?
I think so, yeah.
Now, the policy that you describe here of asking for materials of limited combustibility to be used unless there's a valid BR 135 certification, in fact, that had never been NHBC's policy, had it?
It was not a policy, but it was certainly an answer that I was giving back to our SRPM surveyors when they were asking me. And I believe at this point I was saying to them, if they want to use K15, we're going to have all these issues and we're going to ask them to prove it. If they want, simplicity and risk-free, then change the insulation to a non-combustible one.
Right. So when did the policy become that which you describe in this paragraph?
The policy on that wasn't an official NHBC policy. That was me giving my thoughts, advice to my colleagues.
Well, is that right? You say our current policy. Who's the our?
Oh, sorry. The NHBC current policy at that time was, as we've said, to go through the asking Kingspan to prove it, option 3 assessments, option 4, well, option 4 hadn't really come out at that point, but to prove it via either test evidence or an option 3. That was the NHBC policy at that time.
With great respect, help me with that. I don't think that's what it says. Let's read it again. Our current policy is to request a copy of a test on the proposed cladding build-up. If there isn't one, then we take the view that we can't apply the BBA approval or the BR 135 compliance. As such, it's recommended that a material of limited combustibility be used instead. Now, first of all, our current policy, were you not referring to NHBC's current policy?
Yes, I was.
And when did the NHBC adopt that policy?
When Steve sent out the email to the surveyors, largely saying what was in the BCA guidance note, that either material limited combustibility, a test to 8414, or an option 3 assessment.
There's no reference to option 3 in here at all, is there? It's either MOLC or 8414, as per ADB, isn't it?
There is in this email, yeah, but that was the NHBC policy at the time, as evidenced by the other emails that have been around. I mean, this, as I said, that's next sentence. If there isn't one, then we take the view you can't apply the BBA approval or the BR135. I could have put in a sentence there and saying so they have to justify it by some other means, but this was not an email where we wanted to go down that route, or particularly I wanted to suggest Jane went down that route, because I knew that it was a much more difficult scenario. Jane had a building where they were saying, should we use K15? My advice back to her was, don't.
Yes, thank you. I'm just seeking to understand this current policy and when it came in. You referred to Steve's email to surveyors. In fact, that didn't go until the February of 2015, 3 or 4 months, or 3 months later. So I'm just trying to understand, help me with this. When did what you described there as the current policy of NHBC become adopted?
I'm struggling to remember then. I mean, we were seeing jobs coming in at this time with the K15, and the discussions were that, it would need to be backed up with a option 3 assessment. But I don't know. I'm struggling to recall, sorry.
Were you still asking for comfort letters from Kingspan at this time?
I believe they were on the jobs that were under the old BBA certificate, yes.
Why didn't you tell Jane Keeley that? Why didn't you tell her that in respect of projects before January 2014, or where the initial notice had been filed before that date, you just had to get approval from Kingspan and it was fine? Why didn't you tell her that?
Because I really didn't want to do anything to improve Kingspan's sales figures. We really were finding them a difficult organisation, and a lot of what they were saying was not becoming, it was murky.
Right. So does that tell us that actually you didn't believe in NHBC's policy of continuing to accept pre-1st January 2014 projects using K15 above 80 metres based only on Kingspan's say-so?
I did have a lot of concerns about it, yes. But you're asking a fire engineer whether, they would prefer not to use combustible materials. It's like asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. It's that sort of scenario.
Now let's talk about Arup. I just want to ask you some questions about the meetings that you had with Arup and BRE in November 2014. Can we go first, please, to NHB 50811 and go to page 4 in that email run, please. And here we see Steve Evans writing to Barbara Lane on the 30th of October 2014, copy to Graham Perrier, you and Dave White. Subject, fire performance of PUR and PIR thermoset rigid insulation boards in building envelopes above 18 metres. Now, there's a lot in the detail, but before we look at that, can I just take you, please, to page 22 of your statement, paragraph 79. And you say there, at the end of that sentence, at the end of that paragraph, you say, we were looking to identify second sentence, I apologise. Second sentence. We knew Arup had been involved in considering fires in high-rise buildings, so wanted to get their views. In particular, we were looking to identify if Arup could assist us with understanding the safety issues relating to ACM. In essence, Barbara Lane at Arup agreed that it was not safe. Was there a particular issue with ACM that had prompted the contact with Arup, as opposed to insulation?
No, I don't recall a specific job that was on our minds at this time that had ACM on it when we went to meet Dr. Lane.
Right, and I asked that because the first bullet point of the email, and we can get back to that, please, NHB 50811, page 4, the first bullet point there is dealing with insulation, and indeed that's the title of the email itself. Yes?
Yes, yes. I mean, I recall that the thrust of this meeting was really to discuss, in essence, K15.
Yes. So you said earlier that in fact it had been prompted by ACM, and you said it in your statement. But looking at the
I would agree.
email that kicks it off, it looks as if it's insulation, isn't it?
It was, yes.
Now, if we go back to Steve Evans' email, please, is now in front of us, you can see the first bullet point says this: in looking at key aspects of design to maintain acceptable levels of fire safety over the expected life of residential buildings, we have over the past months reviewed potential fire risk, where combustible construction materials are installed within external walling envelopes of drained and ventilated rain screen facades. In focusing on an evaluation of true performance, the materials of greatest concern include PIR/PIR, thermoset rigid polyurethane board products, which are promoted by manufacturers for extensive use in external envelopes of multi-storey buildings exceeding 18 metres high. Now, just pausing there, what review is Steve Evans referring to? You see in the third or second line of that first bullet point, he says, have over the past months reviewed potential fire risk. What is the review?
I'm trying to recall if there was a. I know that after sometime in the early part of 2014, Steve got some jobs together which had come in under the new BBA certificate, and had asked me to take a look through, informally this was not a formal process, informally look through what was being proposed to see if it was going to create, concerns with regards to the use of the K15 and the cladding panel. So that had been carried out, and I would guess that since that there would be, a few more jobs had come in where maybe it was being proposed. That's all I can guess, is that those are the jobs that Steve was referring to at this point.
Did you understand when you got this message in copy that this was a reference only to insulation, or did it also include external cladding panels?
Principally, this was the insulation we were mostly concerned with. We knew we certainly knew the issues with regards to ACM panels, but the meeting was not about that. This meeting was, us trying to find a way through that possibly, K15 and others could be acceptable.
Looking at the second bullet point, it says, in accordance with our technical standards and building regulations, ADB compliance, NHBC has regularly requested that fire performance should be proven by testing under the BS 8414 and BR 135 requirements for high-rise buildings exceeding 18 metres. This has resulted in a greater number of these fire tests being commissioned by manufacturers in attempting to prove performance of their insulation products on facades above 18 metres. However, the results from this type of testing does not always confirm the safe levels of performance that are hoped for. Now, that wasn't strictly true, was it? Because NHBC historically had accepted letters from Kingspan in lieu of successful tests under BS 8414 to BR 135 criteria, and they were still doing so.
The letters were under the old BBA. This was in the, the new world of the latest BBA, right, that we were doing this process.
Well, that distinction doesn't leap from that text, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Do you know why?
I don't. Looking at this, I didn't draft this one. I think this was Dave that drafted this.
And do you know why Steve Evans says here that large-scale testing doesn't confirm safe levels of performance?
We were looking forwards. We were trying to. Sorry, I'm going back to your earlier question. We were looking forward at this point, trying to sort out the situation as it was with K15 and the current BBA, and that was the reason why we were looking for a route forward on that.
No, that's not right, is it? With great respect, Mr. Lewis, it says NHBC has regularly requested that fire performance should be proven not NHBC is proposing going forwards to do so. It's looking at the past.
Sorry, where's that sentence?
Well, we're looking at the second bullet point,
Yeah.
first and second lines.
Mm.
After the words in bold, NHBC has regularly requested that fire performance should be proven. It's looking historically at the position, isn't it? That's what it's about, not the future.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, with regards to the, the latest situation and the testing, the TRESPA test, the terracotta test.
Well, forgive me, I'll put the point again, because you've gone back to it and sought to qualify it. But this is not, is it, telling Barbara Lane in plain terms that historically, until the 1st of January 2014, NHBC regularly accepted, in fact, universally accepted K15 simply on the basis of the manufacturer's say-so because the BBA certificate said it could.
No, we didn't. Those words are not in here.
No.
That inference is not in there.
No, it's not. And therefore, by saying it has regularly requested that fire performance should be proven by testing was wrong, or at least only a half-truth.
That's probably the case, yes.
Yeah. Now, I mean, can you explain why? I know you didn't draft this as you say, but can you explain why Steve Evans would have chosen only to present a half-truth to Barbara Lane, whose assistance he was seeking?
I can't. Like I say, it was the situation at that time. The old BBA certificate jobs were one issue. This was the new BBA certificate jobs in the current situation.
Mr. Chairman, we're mid-string, and
Yes.
I'd quite like to finish this string off, if I can. It'll take about 10 minutes, though. That's the problem. I'm happy
Well,
to
I
break
think
now.
you could manage another 10 minutes, couldn't you, Mr. Lewis, before
that's
we have a
fine.
break? Yes.
I'm very grateful, thank you. Now, after the list of bullet points, the email continues, and we need to scroll down page 4 to where it says an internal meeting. Do you see that?
Yes.
An internal meeting was held recently involving NHBC heads of department responsible for building control and building standards, including NHBC standards and technical. Now, just note that sentence. He goes on, we agreed that our next course of action should be to hold initial discussions with recognised fire experts whereby issues of concern could be considered without prejudice on a purely technical basis in relation to current knowledge, including building regulations and existing standards on fire performance. We would greatly value your input and the recognised Arup expertise concerning this particular issue. Hopefully it can help NHBC in progressing towards practical clarification on what can reliably be understood from performance testing and for potential fire engineering input regarding combustibility of insulation products and external surfaces of multi-storey facades and external walls to limit fire spread. If you'd be interested in meeting, please get back to me so that we can provide some dates to arrange a meeting, possibly at the BRE Garston offices. Now, did you attend the meeting that's referred to there, which involved NHBC heads of department responsible for building control and building standards, including NHBC standards and technical? We need to go back a page, I think, so I can show you the precise text. Page 4 at the bottom. The internal meeting. Did you attend it?
Yes, I believe I did, but I struggle to remember really which meeting it was.
Do you remember whose idea it was to approach Arup with these questions?
I think that was Steve.
What was your role to be in that meeting?
We were just, so that, well, we all had our own set of queries on this issue. We were going as a group of people, all with our own queries, and with the aim of the meeting was that each of us would raise those particular queries and see.
Now, if we go to page 3 of this email string, we can see that Barbara Lane responds to you all the same day, 30th of October 2014, about an hour later. And she says, Steve, I'm on holiday, but Jamie will call you to sort dates. Arup are actually deeply concerned about the lack of understanding of assemblies and the ongoing incorrect use of test reports for individual materials being applied to more complex building envelope forms. The use of highly combustible materials in residential buildings is now simply an accident waiting to happen. We are getting some traction with clients, and there is definitely the beginning of a shift in emphasis. We would be delighted to address this issue with NHBC and BRE and appreciate you contacting us. I don't need to take you to page 4. It just says Barbara. Now, did Barbara Lane's timely response, as we can see from the timing, indicate that she believed that this was an accident waiting to happen? Did that concern you?
The speed of the response didn't. No, we knew.
No,
that.
I'm sorry, my fault. Did her reaction that it was an accident waiting to happen concern you?
To some extent, we had by this point, as I say, we'd seen the fires in the Middle East and other places, and I think we all knew that there was a possibility of something of that nature could happen in the UK.
Did anybody, to your knowledge, at this point, given her use of that expression, and as we saw 2 weeks later, your precise adoption of it in your discussions with Jane Keeley, prompt anybody at NHBC to go back to Brian Martin and tell him that, in fact, there was a real, as opposed to a negligible, risk to the buildings for which NHBC and others had approved combustible material in external facades over 18 metres in the past?
No, I don't believe anybody did any of that, no.
And why is that?
Partly because, as we said, the issues were not just the insulation, it was the mix of insulation and external cladding panel would have a big effect on it. That bit we were not clear on at that point as to where those parameters lay. Otherwise, I don't know. I think we kind of all assumed that Brian had his ear to the ground, and he must also be aware of these situations and what was going on. It didn't seem credible that he was sitting in an isolated tower without knowing of the same concerns that us and Arup were facing.
Was that an assumption you remember making at the time?
Well, I didn't have, at this point, I had no contact with Brian Martin. I mean, I don't think I'd even met him. All I'd saw was an email via Steve, which was saying, Brian sent this email.
Yeah.
I wasn't sort of, my mind was focused on, what was happening on the time, rather than thinking we need to go and tell this to Brian. Now, that was not my way of thinking at the time.
Given that in the 11th of July 2014, Brian Martin had been told by Steve Evans that just because there's no test evidence doesn't mean it's not safe. I paraphrase, but that's the beginning of the 4th paragraph in that email. You'll remember it. Given that Brian Martin had been given that assurance by NHBC, my question is, did anybody at this stage now, given that you've had a recognised industry expert tell you that it was an accident waiting to happen, not think to go back and correct the impression that Steve Evans' 11th of July email had given him?
I don't believe anybody did that, and I don't recall a discussion at the time where we said, should we go back to Brian or not? I don't recall it featuring.
And did anybody on this email chain, having received this reaction from Barbara Lane, did anybody, either you or Steve Evans, Graham Perrier or Dave White, suggest stopping the use of, or the approval of combustible materials over 18 metres, and the adoption of the policy that 2 weeks later you told Jane Evans had been adopted, Jane Keeley had been adopted?
Sorry, the first part of the what was the key word on your question, please?
Well, having received this email from a recognised industry expert, Barbara Lane, did anybody who received this email, yourself included, suggest stopping approving use of K15 other than in accordance with the policy that 2 weeks later you told Jane Keeley NHBC had adopted?
No, I don't believe there was. No, I don't think that happened. No.
Why is that, do you know?
I don't know.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. Thank you very much. Well, we'll have a break now, Mr. Lewis. We'll resume, please, at 11:45 And as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence when they're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. You'd like to go with the usher then? Thank you. Thank you. 11:45, please. Would you ask Mr. Lewis to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Lewis, ready to carry on, I hope?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I now want to ask you about the meetings with BRE and Arup in late November 2014. I think they were meetings on the 25th with Arup and the 27th of November, respectively. Now, you took notes of both those meetings and you sent them to Steve Evans on the 10th of December 2014. Let's look at those. NHB 50829. What we see here is a summary, as you say, of each of the two meetings held recently regarding the use of combustible components within external wall systems. And the first one you deal with is the meeting with Arup in London on the 25th of November 2014. And you identify who was in attendance. You can see them there, Barbara Lane and Charlotte Robin, you, Steve Evans, Graham Perrier, and Dave White, respectively, all from NHBC. And AF, I think, is short for Arup Fire. Looking at paragraph 1, it says this. AF stated that they had been approached by Kingspan to offer an opinion about the use of Kingspan K15 on high-rise buildings. However, AF did not wish to be involved with only one manufacturer, but rather wished to see the issues tackled across the entire section of the construction industry. Now, just pausing there, was this when you first learned that Arup were not, in fact, preparing the assessment report that Kingspan had promised NHBC at the meeting you attended on the 6th of August 2014?
Yes, we got a very different story from Arup Fire from what we were getting from Kingspan.
Were you surprised by that?
I think we kind of suspected that this was the case. You know, Kingspan were not coming up with that report. They weren't able to come up with letters of comfort to say how it was going. So I think we were already suspicious that Arup Fire were not able to do what Kingspan wanted.
So this was it therefore the first time that NHBC learnt that this report promised by Kingspan was not in fact coming?
Well, it was the first time we learned that it wasn't coming.
I see.
Up to this point, I believe Kingspan was assuring us that it would happen.
Yes. Now, do you remember what the reaction of Steve Evans was to that news?
Like I say, I don't think we were totally surprised.
No, but disappointed?
Yes, disappointed. Yes, disappointed is probably the best word.
Now, going on with the meeting points, you say this at para 2. AF are deeply concerned about the use of combustible components within external wall constructions of high-rise buildings. And then 3, AF feel that the current guidance is not sufficiently robust. And then continuing with the rest of it, AF wish to create new guidance based around bands of building risk and building height. AF are preparing an article for Architects Journal discussing the issues and risks. AF handed over a copy of LPC 1582, requirements and tests for LPCB approval of non-load-bearing external cladding systems fixed to and supported by a structural steel frame. AF considered this to be the level of performance that wall build-up should achieve. AF queried the position of a BCB, stating that in AF's view, NHBC BCS can insist on any level of performance that they deem appropriate. NHBC SE, Steve Evans, advised that ADB2 is deemed to satisfy requirement B3, and so legally NHBC cannot require any increased level of performance. AF stated they would be interested in working more closely with NHBC to establish new acceptance criteria. And then there's a summary over the page at the top of page 2. You say, it was felt by NHBC that AF were looking at the issue from a risk-based fire engineering perspective, whilst laudable, this didn't assist from a BCS perspective, where acceptance criteria is already published within ADB2 BS 9991. NHBC feels that the current position is that systems need to be assessed according to the criteria of BR 135, this being the performance criteria issued by CLG. Now, the summary there, was that something actually said? Does that recall discussions at the meeting, or is it your summary?
I believe after the meeting we got together in a coffee shop to debrief between us, and that was kind of the conclusions that we picked out from the meeting.
So it was the NHBC takeaway, as it were, rather than the expression of something said at the meeting.
Yes.
Yes. Now, is it right, therefore, that you found out from this meeting that Arup Fire first shared your concerns about the use of combustible insulation materials above 18 metres?
In addition to the earlier email from Dr. Lane, but
Yeah.
yes.
And also they believed the guidance was inadequate, yes?
Yes.
And that they were planning on doing the same thing that the NHBC had done through the BCA, namely producing guidance for industry, yes?
Yes.
But they wanted to increase levels of performance based on LPC 1582, yes?
Yes.
But NHBC didn't, in a nutshell.
Well, it wasn't that we didn't want to, it was we had to work within the confines of the published documents that supported building regulations. We couldn't, well, we felt that we couldn't step outside of that because that was the criteria set, as I said there, that's the performance criteria that the MHCLG had set for strict building regs minimum compliance, and that was the criteria we had to work with.
Did NHBC actually take any legal advice on that question, or was that an assumption?
I'm not aware that we did, but it fits with, this is the building regulation process. It's minimum standards. Those minimum standards are kind of described within the documents that support it.
Let's just look at your statement, please, page 22, paragraph 81. And you say there, in the last sentence, Arup's view was that ADB was largely out of date, and as this was a modern product, NHBC were entitled to ask for higher requirements. Which product was the modern product referred to? Was that K15?
It wasn't just K15, it was, a number of products which had been come into existence since the last review of ADB.
Did you agree that ADB might have been out of date with respect to those products?
Yes.
And as a result of that view, was there any discussion about taking it to government and asking them to revise or review ADB, particularly in light of those developments and concerns about them?
As far as I'm aware, that the comments, I know that I regularly said to Steve and or Diane, is there any news on the revised ADB? They were the ones that had the contacts linked directly with the ministry to find these out. I'm not aware that anything happened specifically straight after this meeting, but I'm sure, and I do believe it was a question that was asked at fairly regular intervals, around this time.
Mm. Do you remember having a discussion with Diane Marshall around the time or as a result of this meeting?
No.
Now let's then look at the BRE meeting 2 days later, the 27th of November 2014, which you also cover in the same document. If we go back to it, please, at page 2, you can see there's the title. The meeting's at Watford, 27th of November 2014. And again, we have the attendees there. This time it's Sarah Colwell, Steve Manchester and Steve Howard from the BRE, and the same quartet from NHBC, including you. Now, I don't want to go through all of this in detail, but I think it's right to say that Sarah Colwell took the meeting through BS 8414 testing and gave a summary of BR 135 classification, yes?
Yes.
And if we go to 9A, point 9A on page 3, she says this: SC clarified the following. A, the wording of para 12.7 of ADB2 includes all major components of a cladding system, including the external finish. You see that?
Yes.
Now, on that precise point, did Sarah Colwell explain how the wording of 12.7 led to that meaning?
She didn't. It was a question that I believe I raised at the meeting, paraphrased does BRE think that paragraph 12.7 includes all the major components, or is just restricted to the insulation and not the external finish?
Right. What made you ask her that question?
Because at this time, the kickback we were getting anytime we raised this on a job was ADB doesn't say that, it only includes the insulation. So why are you concerned about the cladding finish?
I see. But at this time, chronologically, I think you will agree that BCA Technical Guidance Note 18, issue 0 of June 2014, which had already been out there for some 5 months, had already made it very plain under option 1 that all elements, as it says, of the cladding system needed to be material of limited combustibility, including external facings. So given that that was the BCA's expressed position, drafted for it by you, and approved by Steve Evans, why were you asking her for her opinion on this point?
Just to get further clarification that we were on the right track. I mean, I was clear in my mind that we were on the right track, but to hear it from the mouth of somebody in a high up senior position at BRE just helped to strengthen that we clearly had not, definitely had not got it wrong.
And when she clarified it, did you detect in her clarification that she was in any doubt about it?
No.
Right. You've recorded her as using the words including the external finish, which I think is slightly different from what's in the BCA note, which I think says external facings. Do we take it that there's no distinction, or was not intended to be a distinction?
No, the external finish in this case, I meant, whatever the external cladding panel was.
So you're not, let's be very clear, you didn't ask her about, and you didn't understand her to be addressing the surface
No.
of the product, but the whole product, whether or not it was a composite product.
Yes, I was not, for clarity, I was not referring to the surface spread of flame upon the, the external facade finish in that term. I was meaning, in this case, whatever cladding panel was used as the outermost element.
It had to be a material of limited combustibility.
To meet under the wording of 12.7, yes.
Did that mean, I think the answer, you've given it to me, but forgive the repeat, does that mean that that the whole panel had to be of limited combustibility throughout, i.e. including any core?
Yes.
Now, first, was there any discussion at the meeting about how that requirement, as you had and she had read it from 12.7, was consistent with diagram 40 and the option there to have a panel which was class B, S3D2, but class B, which of course was not material of limited combustibility?
I don't recall the discussion, and I don't recall that we... No, the discussion was purely around this part of ADB relating to, paragraph 12.7 and the ones before and after it.
So nobody turned back a page in ADB and said, well, if that's right, how does diagram 40 work?
No.
Was that a question that had occurred to you at all?
Well, I knew it was... I knew it was a bit of ADB where two things didn't fully make sense, but, it wasn't an either-or. You had to comply with both. To comply with ADB guidance, you had to meet both sets of requirements. So even if, if diagram 40... But you have to bear in mind, I think diagram 40, it also applies to, non-residential buildings, a whole range of buildings, whereas 12.7, predominantly, I think, was residential. Actually, no, I don't think it is just residential. I think it applies to all buildings over 18 metres.
It does.
Yeah.
Now, leaving aside the question of how 12.7 and diagram 40 might relate to each other with that interpretation, let's park that. My next question is, had NHBC thus far up to November 2014, been implementing the practice identified by the meaning of 12.7, which Sarah Colwell clarified, and requiring that all external panels, including the core, be of material of limited combustibility?
I can't speak for what the surveyors were doing. I can only speak for if I was ever asked the question and on the jobs if I dealt with them. That was what I would have done.
All right, I can understand why you say that, but I'm after NHBC's practice. In other words, what were its building control officers, its approved inspectors doing? Were they requiring external panels, including composite external panels with a core, to be composed fully of material of limited combustibility, in accordance with the interpretation that you and Sarah Colwell shared?
I'm not sure what they were doing. I can't give a view on that one.
Was it not your business to make sure that your seniors understood, and we know who was at the meeting, of course, but make sure they understood that the interpretation of 12.7 that we see clarified here by Sarah Colwell at your request was carried through into practice?
It was one of the reasons why I brought it up at the meeting, just so that my seniors could hear it from the likes of Sarah Colwell. Yes, I would have, I would expect that as the senior leaders, they then pick it up and run with it.
Do you know why they didn't?
I don't. I mean, at the time, we were very much focused on option 3 reports that were that were coming in by this point.
What was NHBC's policy in respect of a Class B rain screen panel at this time? Was a Class B rain screen panel accepted on buildings over 18 metres, as diagram 40 might suggest it could be, or was NHBC refusing to accept Class B rain screen panels on buildings over 18 metres on the basis that it didn't comply with paragraph 12.7 as understood by you and Sarah Colwell?
At this point, we would have been saying we need an option 3 report.
That's an answer to a slightly different question. Before you decide that you want an option 3 report, don't you have to consider whether or not option 1 is satisfied if your client tells you it is?
Yes, I mean, we would have gone through the process, It doesn't meet option 1. Does it meet option 2? Great if it did. Most of them didn't.
Indeed.
So the next thing was, you need to, Mr. Client, Mr. Builder, you need to prove this via option 3.
Understood that logic. Just going back half a step, was NHBC by this time or after this clarification from Sarah Colwell telling building control officers that they could not accept a rain screen panel as compliant with the primary route to compliance using diagram 40? In other words, they had to reject a Class B rain screen panel because it didn't satisfy option 1, notwithstanding diagram 40.
Well, there wasn't a policy drafted up or, to immediately to go out to the surveyors to say that. It was assumed that these were building control surveyors that knew ADB, they should know this.
Well, what was NHBC's public position at this time? Was it option 1, which meant that all building control officers, approved inspectors, when presented with a rain screen panel with a composite core, which was Class B, were required to refuse it under option 1? Was that the position?
Yes.
And are you confident that all of NHBC's building control service officers understood that?
I can't be sure that was the case. There was a mixed bag of abilities.
Lewis, just help me with this. You told us more than once that you had to work as building control surveyors within the confines of ADB. You couldn't impose any stronger rules. What was your attitude if the client said, well, look at diagram 40, it says I can have a Class B panel?
We would say, yeah, but look at paragraph 12.7.
So at that point there
It
would
says-
be a dispute. Do you recall any dispute of that sort arising?
Yes, I remember. Well, I recall. Yes, that particular scenario was put to us on a number of occasions, I do believe, by, builders, their fire engineers, people like that.
And they just accepted your view, did they?
No, they would then kick back and say, then 12.7 only covers the insulation.
Yeah.
We had to be very robust. We were taking a lot of flack from our clients as to why we were, in their view, asking for more than what ADB said. And these clients were then getting their fire engineers to come and join in the attack on us to justify their point of view. And we were, as I say, fighting back on this on many fronts, on many schemes. And, it was causing a considerable amount of stress at our end because of, of what was going on at the time.
And no one thought to invite CLG to clarify the position?
Well, we'd already sought our own view on it. I'm trying to recall we'd already asked Brian Martin, I think by this point, did he consider that 12.7 applied to the external finish?
No, I'm thinking of the particular discrepancy or apparent discrepancy between 12.7 and diagram 40. So there you've got a clear, on one view of the matter, a clear conflict.
Yes.
And on another view of the matter, no conflict. Did no one think to put that question to CLG?
I don't believe we did put that question, no.
Right.
But I do believe at about this time the BS 9991 review was coming up, and as part of BS 9991, the 2011 version more or less said the same as ADB. And when the consultation for the new version of that one came up, we put together our thoughts as to how that section of 9991 should be amended to make it clearer, to remove some of these issues. And as far as I can see, mostly my comments on that were included in the 2015 version of 9991. Had ADB been up for a draft commentary at the same time, we would have said the same thing in that, to try and remove this ambiguity between the two things.
Thank you. Yes, Mr.
Now, yes, forgive me. Under point 10 on the screen, we can see that Sarah Colwell recommends document LPS 1582 as the more onerous benchmark for use within the insurance industry, and I think you rejected that because it was not in accordance with ADB, and you felt obliged to accept the minimum standards in ADB. Is that right?
We felt that we couldn't insist on the higher standard. Obviously, we wanted the higher standard, but we had to be sure that of what we could reasonably insist on.
Yes. And then beneath that, you see the summary. NHBC welcomed the clarifications by BRE as well as the useful background which led up to the publication of BR 135. NHBC was unaware of the existence of a BR 135 classification certificate. And Steve Evans, I think, clarified this, and you clarified it earlier in your evidence yesterday. In fact, it's right, isn't it, that NHBC were not aware of the potential availability of a classification under BR 135 until you were alerted to it by Sarah Colwell?
Yes, we didn't know at that point that BRE did an 8414 test and as one report and then issued another report to classify to BR 135.
And given that, ignorance until that time, if I can use that word without being rude, without knowing about the availability of a BR 135 classification certification by the BRE up to this point, how did NHBC believe that build-ups of external walls, either through large-scale testing or desktop studies, was found acceptable?
Because the data was clearly available within the 8414 report.
So does it work like this, that the option 3 was to proceed purely on the basis of the underlying 8414 data, in other words, the data spat out by the test, and not on the basis of the interpretation of that data and a judgment as to whether or not it met BR 135?
Yes, the information that was necessary to anybody doing an option 3 report was in the 8414 test report. The BR 135 summarised just said the highest temperatures, the criteria were met. There was no additional information in a 135 report that was not already in the 8414 report.
Well, there are two parts to it. There's the doing of the test under 8414, and there is a judgment as to whether the results of the test meet the set criteria contained in BR 135. Yes?
Yes.
The BRE classification report did the latter of those, didn't it?
It did, yes.
You then discovered.
Yes.
Do we take it that option 3 was launched on the basis that identified bodies, BRE, Warrington, Exover, and Chiltern, could not only read the test data, but also make the decision as to whether that test data met BR 135, and then use that to extrapolate to a different build-up?
It was not difficult for the data, that BR 135 says as long as the temperatures at level 2 don't exceed 600 minutes within a 15-minute time period, that was the criteria of BR 135. All of that information was clear in the graphs in the 8414 report. It was not, in my view, complex data. It's GCSE maths, physics, to look at a graph and see where the maximums were reached and at what time. So, it was easy to, fairly easy to interpret that. The other bit of the BR 135 classification was to give guidance on how much of the facade collapsed. And again, the whole point of that, there was not a specific building regulation section which said you must have X amount of collapse of a facade system. All there was, that information in the BR 135 was then for, could be taken and used sort of where it was needed, under other risk assessment measures. Typically, as I found, the only real place I found was that dry riser inlets under BS 9990, it said place the inlet in an area where it's not likely to be affected by falling debris. The BR 135, section on that would have been useful information for anybody following that guidance in 9990.
But it's right, isn't it, that BR 135, just exploring this a bit further, does contain criteria about mechanical performance?
Yes, that's what I'm referring to now.
Yes, exactly right, which is not, I think, referred to in approved document B.
No, it's not.
Other than by reference to BR 135 itself as part of the alternative route to compliance.
Yes.
And that wouldn't be spat out by the data on an 8414 test, would it?
No, the data didn't cover that. But
so if you picked up the data from an 8414 test, you wouldn't be able to tell anything about mechanical failure or performance.
You would get an idea looking at the photographs and the report as to how much of the system had opened up during the fire.
Yeah.
That would give you an idea of how much was likely to be lying on the floor.
Yeah, but without the BRE who do the test, giving you a classification certificate which tells you what happens to mechanical performance, somebody else picking up the data would have if not no idea, certainly much less of an idea about how mechanical performance fared in the test.
That is true, but even if you'd followed paragraph 12.7 and used non-combustible materials, you still could have an awful lot of collapsed debris on the floor, after a fire situation.
Yes, but not as a result of using non-combustible insulation.
No, there was no limits on, if the insulation didn't burn but just all fell off, that would have still complied with paragraph 12.7.
Yeah. So in order to know whether or not your full system was going to present a risk of mechanical failure, which would come in a number of different ways, and you can see them actually in LPC 1583, pooling, falling debris, delamination, for example. The BS 8414 test wouldn't tell you that. You'd need a classification report, wouldn't you?
It only gave very limited information on the collapse, and like I say, we knew that facades in a fire situation there would be a sizable amount of falling debris. A curtain-walled system, we knew that glass shatters and drops, and that's was well known.
Yes.
You didn't need a BR135 to quantify the amount. You knew that it would happen in any fire event anyway.
Now, the last heading here is action following the meeting, which says this: NHBC discussed its position and determined that from a BC point of view, there is no requirement to limit prevent the collapse, partial collapse or falling of debris from an external wall construction during a fire situation. These matters are mentioned in various other British standard documents, and so are a matter for the building design team to take into consideration when other such documents are being applied. Now, we've covered this just now, but why did NHBC not feel that this was something that they should take into account?
What I was referring to in that was, whereas there were various, Regulation B41 said, inhibit the spread of fire. If there was a similar regulation that said, make sure that bits of the building don't fall on top of the main escape routes, then we would have felt that there was, a building regulation requirement to deal with that. But there wasn't, there wasn't a specific building regulation saying, to that effect. All there was, as I referred to with the dry riser inlet British standard, was guidance in those that said, take account that you could have falling debris, and that was why that was the the inference of what I was getting at with that paragraph.
Well, let's just nail this down rather than me asking you generalities about it. Can we go please to BRE 405555? This is BR135 third edition, which is written by Sarah Colwell and Tony Baker, and it was published in 2013. And if we go in this, please, to page 33, I just want to show you what it says about mechanical performance. It says under B2.4, left-hand side, no failure criteria have been set for mechanical performance. However, ongoing system combustion following extinguishing of the initial source shall be included in the test and classification reports, together with details of any system collapse, spalling, delamination, flaming debris, or pool fires. The nature of the mechanical performance should be considered as part of the overall risk assessment when specifying the system. Now, without a decision made by BR135 about mechanical performance setting out those details, a simple set of test data would be insufficient, wouldn't it?
Well, it says there that it shall be included in the test report as well as the classification report. So
yes.
So that information was already in the test report.
And then the nature of the mechanical performance should be considered as part of the overall risk assessment when specifying the system. So that tells you, doesn't it, that you need both?
Both what?
both the test and the classification reports, and specifically the details of any system collapse, spalling, delamination, flaming debris, or pool fires.
Yes, but that was it. So it says in the sentence before, that was already in the test report. The classification report just basically repeated that in a shorter form.
But do you accept that BR135 is written into the building, approved document B, at least was from April 2007, yes?
Yes.
So meeting the BR135 criteria was written into approved document B, yes?
Yes.
And BR135 is this, yes?
Yes.
And therefore, when considering whether the BR135 criteria are met, that includes mechanical performance as stated here, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And therefore, whether you can get that information from the test data or only from the classification reports, nonetheless, it was critical, was it not, particularly to somebody doing a desktop study, that they would need to have details of mechanical performance, even though those details themselves were not written out in longhand in approved document B.
The data was in the test report.
Now then, let's look at the last action in the following meeting. Following the meeting, if we go back to the meeting note.
Perhaps, sorry, just going back on that point, I mean, the whole point of the classification report is that you have tests, and then the idea is that then you have a shorter summary report that says to anybody without any specialist knowledge, look, here it is, there's the classification that says it meets BR135 from, the test house. A fire engineer, as I say, can go back to the test report and pick out most of that information for themselves without having to have it also spelt out to them in that formal way. The evidence is all there for a fire engineer to pick.
Right. Now, building on that, therefore, let's go back to where I wanted to go, which is the text I've just read to you, action following the meeting. You can see it says NHBC discussed its position and determined that from a BC point of view, there is no requirement to prevent the collapse, partial collapse or falling of debris, etc. And you say these matters are mentioned in various other British standard documents, and so a matter for building design team to take into consideration when such other documents are being applied. That's wrong, isn't it? Because from a BC point of view, the BC, the building control officer, had to consider whether BR135 was met, and that included a consideration of the mechanical performance factors we've just looked at.
Yeah, but, as I say, the BR135, it didn't set quantities, it just had to record, it could have said the whole rig collapsed, and that would be as much as you would, as far as it would go.
Well, the impression given by that paragraph is that from a BC point of view, they needn't concern themselves with limited or prevention of collapse, partial collapse or falling debris.
Well, this is what I was saying earlier, what is possibly poorly worded, but what we meant was there isn't a specific building regulation that says, you must, collapse of the facade must not take place, or only a certain amount of collapse must take place. That was not a building regulation thing, and that's where I was coming from with that sentence, as to, obviously we don't want it all collapsing, but there isn't this building regulation that says that to that effect.
Well, I think I've put this to you already, and I'll just put it one more time. I'm suggesting to you that that's wrong. It is only correct that those requirements weren't set out in longhand, but they were implicit from the requirement, if adopting the alternative route to compliance, to pass the BR135 criteria, which included mechanical performance.
In that case, we need to read, we need to get the quantification then from BR135. And there isn't a quantification.
No, there isn't a quantification.
There
is
is just a statement that says record how much debris collapsed.
Now, let's look at the last action following the meeting, as noted by you. NHBC followed up its meeting with BRE with an email, copy enclosed with this email to Sarah Colwell, clarifying what it feels is its position from a BC point of view. NHBC has drafted a revision to BCA guidance note, use of combustible cladding materials on residential buildings, and requested SC to advise of any inaccuracies. A response to this email is currently awaited. Was a response to that email ever received? Do you know?
No, it wasn't.
After the meetings with Arup and the BRE, respectively, what, if any, changes did the NHBC make to its approach to the acceptability of combustible materials on buildings over 18 metres?
Well, we would have taken into account what the above points that are in this email, but I don't think it led to any significant changes to what we were doing, apart from the insistence that we saw a BR135 classification certificate for any fire test. The reason for that was going back to the TRESPA test, where the test failed, and Kingspan was saying to us it didn't fail, it was terminated early, and we said, well, surely that means it failed, and they said no, it was terminated early and it still met the criteria of BR135 for fire spread. And that was the background to us finding out from the BRE that if the BRE had not issued a BR135 classification report, that meant that in their view one could not be issued. We learned that at the meeting with BRE.
Right. Now, can I then move on to July 2015? I want to ask you next about the changes made to the BCA Technical Guidance Note in its second edition, called Issue 1, published in July 2015. Now, you've covered this in your statement, and if we go to that at paragraph 140 at page 37, I just want to look together with you at what you say there. You've got a heading, the 2015 BCA Guidance Note, and at paragraph 140 you say this: in early 2015, I recall, we saw a project for warranty cover or building control services where there were concrete balconies running right around the building. These balconies were considered to be a significant barrier to vertical fire spread. However, considering their impact on the overall building was outside the scope of option 3, this drove home the need for option 4. As a result, Steve Evans instructed me to produce an updated draft version of the 2014 BCA Guidance Note. The 2015 BCA Guidance Note was issued in July 2015. So am I right in thinking that in 2015 you still had no involvement with the BCA?
No, I never had involvement with
No.
BCA.
Do you know why you were instructed by Steve Evans to produce an updated version of guidance for that organisation?
Well, I'd produced the first version. We, between us, had discussed that there was obviously scope for option 4.
Yeah.
So he asked me to draft it.
So it followed, because you'd done the first version, that you should amend that to produce the second.
Yes.
The general question, which I think applies to both, is why was an employee of NHBC, who was not a member of the BCA, drafting both of these guidance notes?
That was how it was done.
You just asked to do it and did it?
Yeah, I just did as I was told.
Now, let's go to that document at CEL 402440. And you can see at the top of the screen, this is Issue 1, June 2015. You see that?
Yes.
And the title is the same, Use of Combustible Cladding Materials on Buildings Exceeding 80 metres in Height. And if we go to page 2, we can see there, 3/4 of the way down the page, option 4. You see that?
Yes.
Now that says, if none of the above options are suitable, the client may consider addressing this issue via a holistic fire-engineered approach, taking into account the building geometry, ignition risk, factors restricting fire spread, etc. Such an approach would be expected to follow a recognised design code such as the BS 7974, Application of Fire Safety Engineering Principles to the Design of Buildings, suite of documents, and be supported with quantitative analyses where appropriate. On what occasions in practice had you seen reports or analyses produced to BS 7974 before you included this option in this revised guidance note?
We had at this point, I believe, seen 2 reports from, I believe they were from Arup Fire, where, an option 4 had been carried out. I can't remember whether, I'm sure that they would have cited the BS 7974 way of doing things because there wasn't really any other suite of documents that would have been appropriate.
Right. I mean, is it right that the BS 7974 documents and standards, which is what they are, and quantitative analyses are not usually used for residential blocks of flats? It's things like airports.
There was nothing to say you couldn't design your block of flats to 7974, but it was very, very rare. I mean, I never saw it because the design guidance in 9991 and ADB was there and it was suited to most situations.
Yeah, and you wouldn't normally resort to 7974,
There wouldn't
save
normally be
for
a need
a
to.
unique and complex building.
No, there would not usually be a need to.
No. And would you agree with this, that option 4 reports could only be completed by a specialist field of experts, such as Arup?
Well, that was what we wanted. We didn't want, something from the builder's, project manager saying, we've done this and this is what we think. We wanted, if we were going to go down this option 4, we wanted it to be from people that knew what they were looking at and could do this, properly.
Was that clear to all of your building control officers from the language of option 4?
Yes, I believe it was.
What was what words in there would you identify that made that absolutely clear to your approved inspectors?
Well, just the the holistic fire engineered approach would imply that you need a fire engineer to do it, or somebody of that ilk.
Why not specify under option 4 who precisely was qualified to undertake this kind of holistic assessment?
Because in truth, we weren't expecting to see many option 4 reports, simply because in a high-rise block of flats with a stay-put policy, it wasn't, it wasn't really going to be suitable to use it in most cases. What we didn't want under option 4, which is what we were getting questioned, was, we've put in sprinklers, so therefore we're not going to have a fire. We didn't want reports of that ilk. We didn't want reports of saying, well, we'll just put in a fire alarm, and that will cover it. We wanted a proper, detailed study of how fires could start and affect cladding systems and, then how that building was still safe in that event.
Do you remember, option 4, the holistic fire engineered solution, was something already written expressly into approved document B?
Yes, ADB, I can't remember the precise wording, but yes, ADB says you don't have to use ADB, you can use,
A design solution?
design solution, yes.
Yes. What was the purpose of including option 4 in here when it was already in the approved documents and when you weren't really expecting it to be used on high-rise residential buildings anyway for the reasons you've given?
Because the guidance note was really just pulling together what was already written in ADB. And it was the same with option 2 and, as we discussed yesterday, option 3, the basis for that.
What, Appendix A?
Yeah, Appendix A covered option 3 and option 4 was dealt with under the section that talks about, fire engineering.
Now, the addition of option 4 was one amendment that you made to Technical Guidance Note 18. It's right, I think, isn't it, that the second change you made to that guidance note in 2015 was as to those who could complete the desktop reports under option 3.
Yes, we changed the wording on that slightly as well.
And what you say in your statement about that is at page 38. We can just look at that, please. This is paragraphs 147 and 148. And at 147 you say, the Rule 9 notice asks about the amendments made to the 2015 BCA guidance note in relation to option 3. In the 2014 guidance note, we focused on 3 bodies as fire engineers, BRE, Chiltern Fire and Warrington Fire, to carry out the assessment in lieu of the tests, A lot, but widened this in the subsequent edition to any suitable UCAS-accredited bodies and suitably qualified fire safety engineers which were expected to have the necessary expertise, quotes unquotes. The reason for this amendment was that we had received feedback from the testing houses that they were being overwhelmed with requests for option 3 A-lot reports. When we re-examined ADB, it became apparent that the A-lot, assessment in lieu of tests, need not be carried out by just those previously mentioned, and so capacity could be increased in line with the building regulation guidance. I do not believe that it reduced the criteria for compliance in any way. Now, let's go back first of all to page 2 of issue 1 of the guidance, 2015 guidance. That was at CEL 402440, page 2. Now, if you look at option 3 there, we can't find in the text of issue 1 the words you're citing and quoting in this paragraph. The words suitably qualified fire safety engineers which were expected to have the necessary expertise. We can't see that in option 3.
I'm looking at it there. It says if no actual test, the client may instead a desktop study report from a suitably qualified fire specialist.
Yes, not suitably qualified fire safety engineers expected to have the necessary expertise, which is how you quote it, as I've just read to you from your statement.
Yeah, but there was a reason for that.
What's that?
That the UCAS testing houses, the staff at those were not strictly fire engineers. They were.
I think we're maybe slightly at cross purposes. Let me try this again. Can we keep this document on the screen, please, and have the statement at paragraph 147 back up again? Page 38. Back up again, and have both on the screen at the same time. I just want to. It's a language question. I just want to be clear about it. So you can see on the right-hand side of your screen that you're quoting a phrase in italics there at the end of the paragraph, suitably qualified fire safety engineers which were expected to have the necessary expertise. But if you look to the left of the screen, you can see that the phrase used in the language of option 3 in the 2015 edition is suitable qualified fire specialist.
Yes.
So how do you account for the difference?
Because the language in the witness statement, that's taken straight from Approved Document B, Appendix A. Approved Document B, Appendix A said, quote, shortened, you either get evidence from a UCAS accredited laboratory or you get a suitably qualified fire engineer. I simply combined those two things together into the term a suitably qualified fire specialist.
Right. So that was your decision.
Yes, this was my wording. Yes.
To prune the words taken from Appendix A and compress them into the expression suitably qualified fire specialist.
Yes, with the emphasis on suitably qualified.
Well, it's not emphasised at all.
Well, it's not, but that was what was in my mind, was that we didn't want just a report from someone who would say, I think it's fine. That was not what we wanted. We wanted a proper study.
Now, you... First, this was a conscious decision, I think, to amend the requirements of those who completed desktops, yes?
We wanted to widen the scope from just those 3 organisations.
Yes, I mean, it wasn't a clarification, it was a positive change.
Yes, it was.
Who made the decision to widen the scope, as you call it?
Believe it came from Steve.
And was the reason for that that expansion solely the feedback from testing houses that they were overwhelmed by requests for option 3 reports that had come as a result of the 2014 first edition of this document?
Well, I can't remember for sure where it came from, but I did read in Steve's witness statement that he understood, or he had got feedback from a BCA meeting that, that was what was being said.
Now, before you made this change, did you pause to consider the implications of the volume of demand for option 3 reports flowing from the first edition of this document in 2014?
Well, we were hearing that there were, that there was a backlog in producing them. I heard as well, and I can't remember where it was from, that, that I think it was BRE hadn't sort of geared up for producing suddenly a large number of these reports. These reports were now, on the schemes that they were coming in on, were schemes which were very much in their final stages, and there was some urgency to get these reports done before the schemes were completed.
Yeah. I mean, what I mean by my question, and particularly the word implications, is this. Did the fact that there was now a large volume of desktop reports that these 3 testing houses were now being asked for signal to you that industry couldn't comply with meeting the linear route to compliance, nor meeting 8414 to BR135, and that this was universally popular and much easier?
No, it was the industry at this point were shifting on their new schemes where they could to using non-combustible materials in their walls. This was the backlog of schemes where the cladding was already installed, and really the developer only had the choice of getting an option 3 report or scaffolding it and removing it all again.
Right, so does that tell us that when did you learn that option 3 was being used in that way? In other words, to correct a historical problem?
It wasn't really, it wasn't really correcting the historical problem. It was, in our way we were looking at it was, you've built this, Mr. Builder, with this set of materials. Please now give us evidence that actually it is safe. Otherwise, we don't feel able to issue a final certificate. It was that sort of approach.
Well, yes, historical in the sense that combustible insulation or combustible materials had already gone up over 18 metres, and it was either option 3 or pull it off.
Yes.
That's what I mean by a historical problem.
Yes, it was a problem on jobs which were still in build at that stage.
Yeah. Now,
yes.
you discovered or you knew that was a problem in 2015. My question is, was that a problem which option 3 was originally inserted into the 2014 version to address?
Largely, yes.
Being a legacy problem created by reliance on the pre-December 2013 BBA certificate.
And the post-December one as well.
Right. Now,
we were saying to, like I say, to Mr. Builder, you want a final certificate, demonstrate that your cladding system is safe.
You say you re-examined ADB and it became apparent to you that the assessment needn't be carried out only by the 3 bodies you had identified in issue 0, BRE, Chiltern Fire and Warrington, but was wider than that. Who was it who... Well, was that you yourself who came to that conclusion based on a reading of ADB, or was that something you were told?
What, that suitably qualified fire engineers would be an alternative? Is that what you mean? Is that who you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was guidance in ADB. I knew it was there. I think Steve had noticed it was there. We didn't put it in the first draft because we thought, let's keep it as narrow as we can and as good as we can. The option, this second draft was expanded to include it.
Yeah, let's just compare the 2 side by side then. Keep the document on the left of the screen up, please, and let's replace the document on the right with the 2014 edition, which is at CEL 403725, page 2 in each case. I just want to compare the language, if I may. Can we just expand option 3, please? And now you'll see that in 2014, the language, as we saw yesterday, was desktop study. You see this under option 3. Desktop study from a suitable independent UCAS accredited testing body, brackets BRE, Chiltern Fire or Warrington Fire, stating whether in their opinion, etc. And that's then amended in 2015 to say desktop study report from a suitably qualified fire specialist stating. So that's the change, yes?
Yes.
Now, having shown you that, I just want to put what Mr. Evans told the inquiry in his evidence in December. Can we please take both of those off the screen and have up day 221, day 221, page 1, line 20. And if we scroll down to line 20, you can see that it's the very first question of the day. And the question is, we were in the middle of discussing the technical guidance notice C1 of June 2015 last night, and it goes up on the screen again. And then we look at options 2 and 3. And then if you turn the page, please, to the next page of the transcript, we end with line 4. That was where we were yesterday. And then the question goes like this at line 5. Now, you say in your statement that we've seen that you weren't seeking to reduce the criteria for compliance. My question is, did you not realise that by not insisting that desktops were done by a fire safety engineer in order to widen the pool of those eligible to perform them, you were reducing the requisite level of expertise? Answer, I didn't consider it that way. Question, why is that? Answer, I saw a suitably qualified fire specialist as being the same as a fire engineer. Question, why the change then? And his answer is this. I didn't actually draft this section. It was drafted by John Lewis, and I saw no reason to amend it. I didn't even make, if I'm honest, the connection between the change. I saw them as one and the same. And do you agree with what he says there? First of all, that you drafted this amendment.
Yes, I drafted the amendment.
Now, he doesn't seem to think that this was a conscious decision taken to widen the pool of people available to write these reports. He says, in fact, he didn't realise it was a change at all. Can you account for how that passed him by?
Well, I'm sure I discussed it, with Steve as to what I was meaning by the proposed wording, because, it would have gone in a draft version before it was issued. Steve would have been known what I was, why I was writing what I was writing.
Right.
And I know what I was writing, why I was writing it.
Right.
I don't know if you want me to elaborate on that now, or that's a further question.
So just so I got your evidence clear, as far as you were concerned, Steve Evans had no doubt at all about what you were intending to achieve by the change.
Well, I would have explained it to him in clear terms, but most likely, this was a long time ago. Maybe Steve couldn't recall it at the time.
Now, do you specifically recall discussing with him the fact of and the reasons for the change that you've told us about?
Yes.
You do. Now, who was a suitable qualified fire specialist? Which is the language in the amended version.
The Appendix A said you could use people from the UCAS laboratories or suitably qualified fire engineers. So in my view, a suitably qualified fire specialist was one of those two camps.
What level of qualification should that person have?
We would expect that it would be from the UCAS laboratories, we would expect that was covered under the PFPF guide, so that would be dealt with that way. And for the fire engineers, we would expect, someone holding a chartered engineer, CEng status.
CEng?
Yes.
Why not say so?
Because, we didn't want, this was a guidance note for the building control bodies to use, who should be and were expected to still be well aware of Appendix A and what the requirements were in there. I mean, it was for those building control bodies to decide who they considered to be suitably qualified. It wasn't for us to spoon feed that to them. But in our case at NHBC, we were very clear on what we considered a suitably qualified fire specialist.
Well, so you say. So why not spell it out? Why not tell them it's got to be a CEng?
We didn't,
engineer.
We didn't think to do that at the time.
No. But when you look at option 4, you see, you did, because in option 4, you ask for a holistic design solution to be prepared and produced by a suitably qualified fire safety engineer. Why the difference in language?
There was no particular reason.
Well, on the face of it, do you accept that there is a difference? When one, you've got a suitably qualified fire specialist, which is not the same as an engineer, and in the second, you've got a suitably qualified fire safety engineer. Anybody reading the two on the page might think, mightn't they, that they were different?
Because you wouldn't expect a UCAS laboratory, which was looking at, comparing tested samples, to then look at a completed building and do it that way. The looking at a completed building and assessing fire spread up a completed building was the realm of a fire engineer. A UCAS laboratory was a materials specialist or a chemist or a physicist, somebody like that would not be used to looking at buildings.
You accept, I think, that there was no guidance, there were no parameters, there were no checks or balances of any kind in this document about who should be completing these reports, what their qualifications were, or what experience they had to have, if any, on external fire spread.
It was a guidance note for building control bodies. They should know. I mean, to deal with a building of this size, there were questions coming up, in our experience, regularly on fire things which were slightly different to what was tested and assessments that were being made. That was a normal thing that would happen. You would expect a building control body that was used to dealing with buildings of this nature to have in place their own criteria for what they considered to be, a suitable fire specialist to advise on those matters.
But given that option 3 was a second alternative route to compliance that you say you took from Appendix A, in other words, an extrapolation or an assessment based on test data, and given that in the first edition you had made it crystal clear who it was who was to conduct those extrapolations or assessments, why not, if you were going to widen the pool, ensure that those doing that exercise would have the same level of qualification as BRE, Warrington or Chiltern by stipulating the level of qualifications and experience they had to have, rather than using the language that you did?
There was no reason other than we didn't want an overly long, detailed, excessively detailed guidance note. And, we just wanted to set out the benchmark parameters of what should, a building control body should be looking at, interpreting them in the way that ADB was already saying. We were just putting in one document what ADB was saying in various different places.
Did you intend to dilute the qualifications in order to make it easier to mop up the backlog?
No, of course not, no.
You say of course not. Did you consider that might be the outcome?
No, we were very, very clear that, this was a robust thing. This had to be done right. We were not looking for something on a headed paper from someone in fire saying, I think this is fine. We weren't wanting that.
So then why not use exactly the same language that you used for the first time for option 4, suitably qualified fire safety engineer?
I don't have an answer, but equally there was no underlying intention to, do as you say. That was not the case. We were, at this point, rejecting an awful lot of reports that were coming in that our clients felt justified or met option 3 or option 4.
Yes, they would, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
They would want you to think that. So my question is, although you may not have intended it, what did you do, if anything, to guard against that as an outcome?
Well, we didn't do anything because we, left it, as I say, we knew what we would accept at NHBC. We weren't there trying to spoon feed other building control bodies. They should have their own sets, they should have their own criteria.
Now, in your statement, you say, and we've seen this, but if we can get back to it if you like, Mr. Liz, you say you had feedback from testing houses that they were being overwhelmed for requests for option 3 reports. Do you remember from whom you received that feedback?
As I say, I can't recall where it came from, but I do recall, as I say, reading Steve's witness statement that it came back once or following a BCA meeting or something like that.
Right. Do you know when that was?
No, I can't remember.
Was
But
it
it would
in-
have been, not long before we wrote the draft, the second draft.
We're testing houses, asking or suggesting that the parameters of those who could complete desktop reports be widened.
Not that I know of, no.
Right. Now, we haven't seen any mention in the notes of the meetings that we saw in late November with Arup and BRE of the concerns that you've expressed, the feedback you've expressed. Do you know why that is? Was it
No.
mentioned?
Again, I recall you questioned Steve on this when he was sitting here. I didn't record it in the meeting notes afterwards. They were not well, it could have been mentioned. I can't recall. It could have been mentioned by Sarah Colwell or the others at that time, and I was busy scribbling notes on other things and didn't note it down. The truth is, I didn't note it down. I can't be sure at the moment whether it was discussed or not discussed. I think Steve is quite sure, or was clear, that it was discussed. I can't say one way or the other whether that's true or not from my recollection.
We've seen no emails or reports or notes of meetings, either internally or as between NHBC and anybody, in which these concerns, this feedback is recorded. Can you explain that?
I can't, no. I mean, it came back to me via Steve.
Right, so you've not seen a document in which BRE or Chiltern or Warrington Fire complained?
No.
No. It was simply something that Steve told you about and you acted on. Is that how it worked?
Pretty much, yes.
Right. Now, we're going to go on, I think, to another topic. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to start it.
Well,
We won't finish it in 2 minutes.
I was going to say, it's very nearly time to break anyway. Wouldn't it be more sensible to stop there?
I think we have 3 minutes till 1 o'clock. It would be sensible to do that and take a...
Right, thank you very much.
On the lunch.
Well, Mr. Lewis, we're slightly ahead of time, but not much. We're going to stop there so we can have some lunch, and we'll be resuming at 2 o'clock, please. And again, please make sure you don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 2 o'clock, please.